In the heart of the American plains, where history is written in dust and drought, some stories are best left buried. They are the tales etched not in stone, but in the silence that falls between the cries of the cicadas and the whisper of the wind through the wheat. The year was 1899. The place was a forgotten corner of Kansas, and the story belongs to the Radcliffe family, a name that became a wound on the memory of the land itself. Their arrival was a quiet affair, but what followed was a sinister harvest, a creeping dread that defied both faith and reason. It was a curse that science, in its cold and certain language, could not explain, and one that the earth itself seemed desperate to forget. If the spectral echoes of the past are what you seek, and this is your first time crossing our threshold, then subscribe to our archives and ensure that no story is ever truly lost to the darkness. The chronicle of the Radcliffe family begins not with a scream, but with the creak of wagon wheels. It was the autumn of 1899. The land around the small, hopeful town of Prairie Bend was parched. A stubborn drought had held the region in its grip for 2 seasons, cracking the earth like old pottery and turning the hopeful green of new wheat into a brittle, dying yellow. Farmers who had staked their lives on the promise of the soil now watched their futures wither under a merciless sun. Prayers for rain went unanswered. The air was thick with the fine, gritty dust of failure and the low murmur of impending despair. Into this landscape of struggle, the Radcliffe family arrived. They did not come like the other settlers, with weary horses and patched clothes, their faces etched with the hard lines of desperation. They came with 4 heavy wagons, pulled by teams of strong, well-fed draft horses whose coats shone with a health that seemed an affront to the dying land around them. The patriarch was Mr. Elias Radcliffe, a man whose silence was as vast and unnerving as the open sky. He was tall and severe, with a face that looked as though it had been carved from old wood and left out in the wind. He never smiled. His eyes, a pale and washed-out blue, seemed to look through people rather than at them. Beside him sat his wife, Mistress Annalise Radcliffe. She was a woman of stark, unsettling beauty, her hair as black as a raven's wing, and her skin as white as bone. She remained veiled, a thin layer of black fabric that did little to hide the impression of a constant, placid stillness. She never spoke a word to the townsfolk, not a single greeting or inquiry. Her presence was a void, a pocket of cold air on a hot day. Behind them in the other wagons rode their children. There were 5 of them, ranging in what appeared to be age from early adolescence to young childhood. Like their parents, they were silent observers, their gazes sweeping over the town with a detached, unreadable curiosity that made the locals shift on their feet and look away. Mr. Elias Radcliffe conducted his business with a quiet, almost dismissive efficiency. He met with the town land agent, a man named Mr. Abernathy, a portly fellow whose optimism was his only remaining currency. Mr. Radcliffe did not haggle. He did not inquire about the drought or the quality of the soil. He simply unrolled a map, pointed to a large tract of land 3 miles north of the town, and stated his intention to purchase it. The plot was over 500 acres, a piece of earth that had broken the spirits of 2 families before him. It was considered cursed by some, hopelessly barren by all. Mr. Abernathy, sweating in his woolen suit, tried to explain the difficulties, the failed wells, the relentless sun. He spoke of the other families, of their hardship and their eventual departure. Mr. Radcliffe listened without expression, his gaze fixed on the map. When the agent had finished his cautionary tale, Mr. Radcliffe produced a leather satchel. From it, he counted out the full price in gold coin. The sound of the metal on the dry wood of the desk was the only sound in the room. It was a sound of finality, a sound that ended all discussion. The land was his. The construction of the Radcliffe homestead was a spectacle of unnatural speed. While other farms struggled to maintain what they had, the Radcliffes built. They did not hire local hands. The work was done by the family alone. From dawn until the last light faded from the sky, they moved with a synchronized, relentless purpose. Mr. Radcliffe and his older sons, Thomas Radcliffe and James Radcliffe, raised the frame of a large, severe-looking farmhouse in a matter of days. The younger children, including the boy named Samuel Radcliffe and his two sisters, Eleanor Radcliffe and Clara Radcliffe, worked the fields, clearing the dead stalks and plowing the cracked earth with an energy that seemed impossible. The townsfolk would sometimes ride out on their own weary horses, intending to offer a neighborly hand or perhaps simply to satisfy their own growing curiosity. They would stop at the edge of the property line, unable to bring themselves to cross it. There was a stillness there, a profound and unnerving silence that was not peace. The birds did not sing in the trees that bordered the Radcliffe land. The familiar drone of insects seemed to stop abruptly at an invisible wall. Animals, with their simple and honest senses, knew before the people did. Dogs, normally eager to chase a rabbit or explore a new scent, would whine and pull at their leashes, their hackles raised as they stared toward the Radcliffe farm. They would tuck their tails between their legs and refuse to go any further. Herds of cattle in the neighboring pastures would press against the far fences, their bodies turned away from the Radcliffe property as if from a coming storm. Wild animals gave the land an even wider berth. Deer tracks would veer sharply away from the property line. Coyotes, whose nightly calls were the music of the plains, were never heard from that direction. It was as if a dead zone had been established, a patch of Kansas that the natural world had collectively decided to shun. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath, and at the center of it all stood the dark, angular house of the Radcliffe family, a silent monument to their intrusion. The humanizing detail, the one flicker of recognizable life that the people of Prairie Bend could cling to, was the sight of the youngest child, Samuel Radcliffe. He was a small boy, perhaps 6 or 7 years of age, with the same dark hair as his mother and the same pale eyes as his father. He was often seen playing alone in the newly plowed fields at dusk, a solitary figure against the vast, bleeding horizon. But his play was not the play of a normal child. He did not run or shout. He did not chase imaginary foes or build castles of dirt. He stood in the fields and he whispered. Witnesses, like the farmer Mr. McGregor, whose land bordered the Radcliffes', would see the boy from a distance. He would be standing perfectly still, his head cocked to one side as if listening to a voice no one else could hear. Then his lips would move. He would speak to the long, distorted shadows cast by the setting sun. He seemed to be in conversation with them. Mr. McGregor, a man whose life was governed by the practical and the tangible, once tried to get closer. He told the men at the general store later that he felt a coldness creep over him as he approached the fence line. He said the boy was not whispering to himself. He was answering questions. The farmer could not make out the words, not clearly, but he heard the cadence. It was the rhythm of a dialogue. The boy would listen, nod, and then whisper a reply to the empty air, to the shifting darkness on the ground. Mr. McGregor said he saw one of the shadows detach itself from the base of a fence post and stretch towards the boy, elongating in a way that defied the angle of the sun. It was then, he confessed, that a primal fear took hold of him. He turned and walked back to his own home, never once looking back. He said he felt the boy's pale eyes on him the entire way. He told the store owner, Mr. Harris, that he would not be going near that fence again. As autumn bled into a cold and unforgiving winter, the strangeness of the Radcliffes became the central, unspoken truth of Prairie Bend. Their prosperity was the most damning evidence against them. While the town's communal well ran low and other farmers had to ration water for their livestock, the well on the Radcliffe property gushed with a seemingly endless supply of clear, cold water. And then there was the wheat. In fields where nothing but dust had grown for 2 years, a crop of wheat began to sprout on the Radcliffe land. It grew with an unnatural vigor, its color a deep and vibrant green that seemed to mock the pale, dying landscape around it. By the time the first snows fell, the Radcliffe wheat stood tall and strong, swaying in the winter wind under a gray sky. It swayed in an unnatural silence. The wind that rustled its stalks seemed to make no sound. It was a field of ghosts, a silent, growing testament to a power that the people of Prairie Bend could not understand. The whispers began in earnest then. They started in the pews of the church after Sunday service and spread to the general store and the saloon. The people of Prairie Bend were simple folk. They believed in God, hard work, and the unforgiving logic of the land. The Radcliffes fit nowhere in their understanding of the world. The talk was of a deal made with some dark entity, a pact signed in exchange for prosperity. They were a family that did not sweat, a family that did not struggle, a family that did not speak. They simply existed, and where they existed, the laws of nature seemed to bend and break. They were quiet and kept to themselves, but their silence was not one of privacy. It felt like a judgment. Their prosperity was not a blessing to be celebrated, but a blight to be feared. The townsfolk began to suspect that something was deeply and fundamentally wrong with the family who had settled on the cursed land to the north. They began to believe that the Radcliffes had not simply bought the land, but that they had brought their own curse with them, a sinister force that was now taking root in the heart of Kansas. The whispers grew louder, spreading from farm to farm like a contagion, and soon they would reach the ears of those who believed it was their duty to confront the shadows, drawing the unwanted attention of both the local clergy and the men of science who passed through the forgotten corners of the frontier. The stage was being set for a confrontation, not of words, but of worlds. The first winter the Radcliffes spent in Kansas was as harsh as any the old-timers could remember. Snow fell in thick, silent sheets, burying the dead fields and isolating the small farmsteads from one another. For the people of Prairie Bend, it was a season of hunkering down, of rationing supplies, and of praying for the spring thaw. It was also a season of watching. From behind frost-laced windows, they watched the smoke that rose from the chimney of the Radcliffe house, a thin, constant plume against a sky the color of slate. They watched as the family moved about their property, seemingly untroubled by the biting wind and the deep drifts. They did not appear to suffer from the cold. They did not appear to suffer from anything at all. Their unnatural wheat crop, which had reached its full height just before the first blizzard, stood frozen in the fields, its golden heads heavy and perfect, an impossible bounty encased in ice. When spring finally arrived, it did so with a sigh of relief that was felt throughout the county. The snow melted, the cracked earth drank deeply, and a fragile sense of hope returned to Prairie Bend. It was time for the children to return to the one-room schoolhouse that stood at the edge of town, a squat, whitewashed building that smelled of chalk dust and oiled floorboards. It was here that the true, undeniable strangeness of the Radcliffe children would be documented, not by gossiping neighbors, but by a woman of method and reason. Her name was Miss Eleanor Vance, the town school teacher. She was a young woman from the East, a graduate of a women's college who believed in the power of education to tame the wildness of the frontier and the superstitions of its people. She was precise, observant, and she kept meticulous records of her pupils' progress. She had heard the whispers about the Radcliffe family, of course, but she had dismissed them as the predictable fears of a small, isolated community. She believed that in the structured environment of her classroom, the Radcliffe children would be revealed as nothing more than shy, quiet farm children. She was profoundly mistaken. On the first day of the new school term, the 5 Radcliffe children arrived together. They walked in a single, silent line, their footsteps perfectly in time. They were dressed in identical, simple clothing of dark gray wool, clean and well-mended. They took their seats at the back of the classroom, their faces blank and unreadable. Miss Vance began the day as she always did, by having each student, new and old, write their name and age on a small piece of slate. It was a simple exercise, a way to gauge the literacy of any new arrivals. When she collected the slates, she felt the first prickle of unease. The names were written clearly: Thomas Radcliffe, age 13, James Radcliffe, age 11, Eleanor Radcliffe, age 10, Clara Radcliffe, age 8, Samuel Radcliffe, age 7. The handwriting on all 5 slates was identical, not similar, not the product of a shared family style. It was a perfect, flawless replication. The loop of the R, the sharp cross of the the precise round curve of the yay. It was as if the same hand had written all 5 names. Miss Vance, a woman who prided herself on her rationality, sought a logical explanation. She assumed that perhaps the eldest boy, Thomas Radcliffe, had written the names for his younger siblings. It was not uncommon for older children to help the younger ones. She called him to her desk and asked him directly. Thomas Radcliffe stood before her, his pale eyes fixed on a point just past her shoulder. He did not fidget. He did not look down. He simply stood, a statue of a boy. He said, in a voice that was eerily flat and without inflection, that each child had written their own name. Miss Vance, still not convinced, decided to conduct a small test. She gave each of the 5 children a fresh piece of paper, a rare and precious commodity in her classroom, and a newly sharpened pencil. She dictated a simple sentence to the class, a line from a book of poetry she kept on her desk. The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog. She walked down the aisles as the students wrote. When she reached the back of the room, her breath caught in her throat. The 5 sheets of paper were laid out on the 5 wooden desks. On each one was the exact same script. The pressure of the pencil, the spacing between the words, the slight upward tilt at the end of the sentence. It was a mirror image, 5 times over. It was a mechanical reproduction. It was impossible. She took the papers and, later that day, pinned them to the wall at the back of the classroom, alongside the clumsier, more varied scrawls of the other children. The 5 identical papers hung there like a declaration. They were a quiet, terrifying testament to a symmetry that did not belong in the natural world. They became the room's atmosphere anchor, a source of deep and creeping unease that settled over Miss Vance every time her gaze fell upon them. The other children in the class felt it too. They avoided the Radcliffes, leaving a wide, empty space around their desks. During recess, the Radcliffes did not play. They stood together under the shade of a lone cottonwood tree, a silent, unmoving cluster. Their movements, when they did move, were unnervingly synchronized. If a bird flew overhead, 5 heads would tilt upward in the exact same instant, with the exact same angle of curiosity. If one of them shifted their weight from one foot to the other 4 would do so in perfect unison. They were like puppets controlled by a single invisible set of strings. The uncanniness was not limited to their handwriting or their mannerisms. It was in their very physical beings. The passage of time seemed to have no effect on them. A season passed, then another. The other children in the schoolhouse grew taller, lost teeth, and their faces began to show the first signs of approaching adolescence. The Radcliffe children did not change. Thomas Radcliffe, who was supposed to be 13, then 14, remained frozen in the body of a boy on the cusp of puberty. The youngest, Samuel Radcliffe, who should have been growing with the boundless energy of a young child, remained small and slight. In fact, the physical distinctions between them began to blur in a way that defied all biological law. One afternoon, as the children were lining up to leave, Miss Vance witnessed something that would haunt her dreams for years. The youngest boy, Samuel, who was 7, stood next to his oldest brother, Thomas, who was 13. There was almost no difference in their height. She stared, her mind refusing to process what her eyes were seeing. The 6-year gap in their ages had vanished. They were not simply brothers who looked alike. They were becoming duplicates. Her scientific mind scrambled for an answer. She had read of arrested development, of genetic oddities, but nothing she had ever encountered in her textbooks could account for this. It was not just their height. It was everything. She began to observe them with a new, horrified intensity. She noticed a small, crescent-shaped scar just below the left eye of the 10-year-old girl, Eleanor Radcliffe. A week later, she saw the exact same scar, pale and silvery against the skin, in the exact same spot on the 8-year-old Clara Radcliffe. And then, a few days after that, she saw it on the youngest boy, Samuel. It was not a birthmark, it was a wound. A wound that had somehow printed itself onto the skin of all the children, regardless of their separate bodies and separate experiences. They shared a single history, a single biology that was written on their flesh. The rumors that had been simmering in the town now began to boil over, fueled by the quiet, terrified observations of the schoolteacher. Miss Vance, in a state of professional and personal distress, confided in the town's spiritual leader, Pastor Miller. She met him in his small, dusty office at the back of the church, the scent of old paper and beeswax heavy in the air. She explained what she had seen. She laid out the identical handwriting samples on his desk. She told him about the synchronized movements, the shared scars, the impossible similarity in their physical size. She reported her conversation with Thomas Radcliffe, his flat, empty voice claiming they had each written their own name. She said she feared for the other children. She said she feared for her own sanity. She told the pastor that the Radcliffe children were not natural. Pastor Miller, a kind but pragmatic man, listened patiently. He initially advised caution. He suggested that family resemblance could be strong, that children in isolated families often developed peculiar habits. But as Miss Vance continued, her voice trembling with a sincerity that was impossible to doubt, his expression grew grave. The whispers in the town took on new, more specific shapes. People spoke of duplication, of unnatural births. Some wondered if the family was the result of some grotesque and forbidden inbreeding, a practice that could twist a family line into a horrifying knot. Others, who had read the sensationalist pamphlets that sometimes made their way out to the frontier, spoke of scientific experiments, of attempts to create life through unnatural means. The Radcliffe family, in their silent, prosperous isolation, became a canvas onto which the town projected its deepest and most primal fears. The core question was no longer about their strange luck with the land. It was about their very nature. How could children of different ages, born years apart, display the same scars, speak with the same voice, and write with the same hand? How could they wear the same face? The story of their strangeness was now reinforced by the meticulous, unwilling testimony of a woman of science and education, a teacher whose job was to impose order and logic upon the world. Her classroom, with its wall of identical handwriting, had become the epicenter of an unexplainable phenomenon. The curse was not just on the land, it was in their blood, in their very bones. It was a curse that science, in the form of a small-town schoolteacher, had tried and failed to rationalize. The community's fear, now given a voice of authority, demanded a more expert opinion. Pastor Miller, his face heavy with a dread he could no longer deny, agreed that the matter had moved beyond the scope of his faith and her pedagogy. He told Miss Vance that a man of medicine was needed. He said he would write to a traveling physician he knew, a man with a reputation for investigating phenomena that lay on the fringes of accepted medical knowledge. A summons was being sent. A scientific mind was being called to confront a reality that science itself could not contain. Dr. Alistair Finch was a man who inhabited the gray spaces between science and superstition. He was not a country doctor who made his living setting bones and delivering babies. He was a man of independent means, a graduate of a prestigious Eastern university who had dedicated his life to the study of medical anomalies, what he called the biological impossibilities that orthodox medicine preferred to ignore. He traveled the country in a specially outfitted carriage that served as both his living quarters and his mobile laboratory, a cramped space filled with brass microscopes, glass vials, and leather-bound journals. He was drawn to stories like the one that came in a letter from Pastor Miller of Prairie Bend, Kansas. The pastor's letter was brief, its tone a mixture of desperation and scholarly restraint. It spoke of a family that defied the natural laws of growth and individuality, of children who seemed to be not siblings, but echoes of one another. For Dr. Finch, it was an irresistible summons. He arrived in Prairie Bend in the late summer of 1900, his carriage kicking up a cloud of the same dust that had greeted the Radcliffes 1 year prior. His first interviews were with the primary witnesses. He spoke at length with Miss Eleanor Vance, the school teacher. She showed him the handwriting samples, which he examined under a magnifying glass for nearly an hour, his brow furrowed in concentration. He noted the identical pressure, the microscopic and consistent imperfections in the pencil's graphite. He concluded, in his preliminary notes, that the probability of 5 separate individuals producing such identical script was, for all practical purposes, 0. He then spoke with Mr. McGregor, the farmer who had seen the youngest boy, Samuel Radcliffe, whispering to the shadows. Dr. Finch was a man of science, but he was not dismissive. He listened to the farmer's account without judgment, making careful notes about the perceived temperature drop and the unnatural elongation of the shadows. He recorded it all, understanding that in cases like this, the subjective experiences of witnesses were often as important as any physical evidence he might collect. He was building a file, a clinical profile of a phenomenon. The most difficult part of his investigation was securing the cooperation of the Radcliffe family itself. He rode out to their farm, a solitary figure in a dark suit approaching the severe, silent house. He was met at the door by Mr. Elias Radcliffe. The patriarch's pale eyes held no welcome, no curiosity, only a flat and profound emptiness. Dr. Finch stated his purpose clearly and professionally. He said he was a physician conducting a study on hereditary traits in isolated family groups. He spoke of the importance of the research, of its potential contribution to medical science. Mr. Radcliffe listened, his expression unchanging. For a long moment, the doctor was certain he would be turned away. Then, without a word, Mr. Radcliffe stepped aside and gestured for him to enter. The inside of the house was as stark and unsettling as the outside. It was impeccably clean, the wooden floors scrubbed bare, the furniture simple and severe. There were no decorations on the walls, no family portraits, no trinkets, none of the small personal touches that make a house a home. It felt less like a dwelling and more like a waiting room. The 5 children were seated at a long wooden table, their hands folded before them. Mistress Annalise Radcliffe stood by the cold hearth, a silent, veiled sentinel. The atmosphere in the room was heavy, oppressive, and unnaturally cold. Dr. Finch, who had spent his life in morgues and anatomical theaters, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the air. It was a coldness of the spirit. He explained to the family that he wished to conduct a simple, non-invasive physical examination of each of the children. Mr. Radcliffe gave a single, sharp nod of consent. The examinations took place in that same room, on a spare cot that was brought out and placed in the center of the floor. The only light came from the room's single large window and the flickering flame of a lantern Dr. Finch had brought with him. The shadows it cast seemed to stretch and writhe in the corners of the room, dancing in a way that felt unnatural and alive. He began with the eldest boy, Thomas Radcliffe. The boy submitted to the examination with a passivity that was more disturbing than any resistance would have been. He was a specimen, not a patient. Dr. Finch placed his stethoscope to the boy's chest, expecting to hear the steady, rhythmic beat of a healthy adolescent heart. What he heard instead made him press the instrument harder against the boy's skin, his scientific composure momentarily faltering. The boy's heart was not beating in a normal rhythm, it was pulsing. A slow, powerful, and deeply irregular thrum that did not follow the familiar lub-dub of a human heartbeat. It was a rhythm he had never encountered before, a deep, resonant pulse that seemed to come from the very core of the boy's being. He moved on to the next child, James Radcliffe. He placed the stethoscope on his chest, the same impossible pulse, slow, powerful, thrumming. He went down the line, from Eleanor to Clara to the small, silent Samuel. In each of them, he found the same heartbeat, but it was more than just the same rhythm. He realized, with a dawning, intellectual horror, that they were beating in perfect, absolute unison. 5 separate bodies, 5 chests, 1 single, synchronized pulse. The discovery was so profound, so utterly contrary to the foundations of his medical training, that he had to excuse himself for a moment. He stepped outside into the fading afternoon light, taking a deep breath of the prairie air to clear his head. He was a man who had seen monstrous births, who had dissected bodies with bizarre and unexplainable growths, but this was different. This was not a malformation. This was a redefinition of what it meant to be an individual. He returned to the house, his face a mask of clinical detachment, and proceeded with the next phase of his examination. He had brought with him the equipment to conduct a basic blood analysis. He explained the procedure to Mr. Radcliffe, the simple pinprick to the finger, the small sample of blood to be collected in a glass capillary tube. The patriarch nodded his consent once more. One by one, the children presented their hands. They did not flinch as the lancet pricked their skin. They did not seem to feel it. A single, dark drop of blood welled up on the fingertip of each child. Dr. Finch collected the 5 samples, labeling them with careful precision. That night, in the flickering lamplight of his carriage, he began his analysis. He placed a drop of blood from the sample labeled Thomas Radcliffe onto a glass slide and positioned it under the lens of his microscope. What he saw was puzzling. The blood composition was unusual, containing cellular structures he could not immediately identify. He made detailed sketches in his journal, his hand moving with the practiced speed of a seasoned anatomist. Then, he prepared the slide for James Radcliffe. He adjusted the focus on his microscope, expecting to see the subtle variations that always exist between the blood of 2 individuals, even siblings. He saw no variation. The blood was identical, the same unusual cellular structures, in the same concentrations. He went through all 5 samples, his movements becoming more frantic, a growing sense of disbelief warring with the evidence before his eyes. The blood of all 5 children was the same, not just the same blood type, a concept that was still in its infancy in medical science, but a perfect cellular match. It was as if the 5 samples had been drawn from a single circulatory system, a single body that had been inexplicably divided into 5 separate physical forms. He wrote furiously in his journal, the scratching of his pen the only sound in the deep prairie night. He filled page after page with his observations, his theories, his frantic, searching questions. What kind of family shared a single pulse? What biological mechanism could possibly account for a shared circulatory system across 5 distinct bodies? He wrote that the Radcliffes were not a family in the traditional biological sense. They were, he theorized, a colonial organism, like a Portuguese man-o'-war, a collection of specialized individuals who were, in fact, parts of a single, larger entity. It was a mad, impossible theory, one that would see him laughed out of any respectable medical society, but it was the only theory that fit the facts he had gathered. He knew he was on the verge of a discovery that would change the face of science, a discovery that would force humanity to reconsider the very definition of life. He knew he had to publish his findings. He spent the next 2 days compiling his notes, preparing a formal paper to be sent back east to his colleagues at the university. He packed his journal, the blood slides, and the handwriting samples into a locked metal case. He knew the evidence was irrefutable. He had documented a phenomenon that science could not explain, but that it could not, in good conscience, ignore. He was ready to leave Prairie Bend and re-enter the world of academic discourse, to present his terrifying and world-altering findings. On the morning of his planned departure, he awoke to find the door of his carriage pried open. The metal case containing all of his research was gone. His journals, his slides, his sketches, every piece of evidence he had so meticulously collected had vanished into the thin morning air. There was no sign of a struggle, no tracks leading away from the carriage. It was as if the case and its contents had simply ceased to exist. Dr. Alistair Finch was a man of reason, but he was not a fool. He knew this was no ordinary theft. He understood, with a chilling certainty, that he had trespassed into a place where the rules of his world did not apply. He had attempted to capture a curse with the tools of science, to pin a shadow to a dissection table, and the shadows had pushed back. Science had tried to explain the Radcliffe family, and it had been silenced. Defeated, he packed what remained of his belongings and left Prairie Bend that same day, never to return. He never spoke of the Radcliffes again. The journal containing his original, frantic notes was gone, a piece of forbidden evidence lost to history. The fear in the town, which had been temporarily held at bay by the promise of a scientific explanation, now returned with a vengeance. If a man of medicine, a man of facts and reason, could be so easily defeated and scared away, then what hope did the ordinary people of Prairie Bend have? Their fear, no longer restrained by the hope of a rational answer, began to curdle into something much more dangerous. It began to turn to violence as the townsfolk's suspicions ignited into a desperate, cleansing fire. The departure of Dr. Alistair Finch left a vacuum in Prairie Bend, and into that vacuum rushed a tide of raw, undiluted fear. The doctor had been their hope for a rational explanation, a dam holding back the superstitious terror that had been building since the Radcliffes' arrival. His silent, hurried flight was not seen as a failure of his science, but as a confirmation of their darkest anxieties. If a man of his learning and experience had been so thoroughly unnerved that he would abandon his research and flee, then the entity inhabiting the Radcliffe farm was something far beyond the realm of human understanding. The story of his vanished notes spread through the town like a prairie fire, each retelling adding a new layer of supernatural dread. The whispers were no longer questions, they were certainties. The Radcliffes were not merely strange or unlucky, they were a blight, a sickness on the land, and their presence was a direct and personal threat to every man, woman, and child in the community. The autumn of 1900 was a season of watching and waiting. The Radcliffe wheat had ripened for a second time, a field of impossible gold standing tall against a sky that promised another hard winter. Their prosperity was a constant, infuriating reminder of their otherness. While other farms struggled, their granary was full. While other families worried about the coming cold, the Radcliffes moved with their usual serene and silent purpose. This quiet success, once a source of mere suspicion, was now seen as an act of aggression. It was as if they were drawing the life from the surrounding land, hoarding the good fortune that rightfully belonged to the rest of the community. The fear that had been simmering for a year now began to harden into a cold and righteous anger. This anger found its voice in the town saloon, a dusty, dimly lit room that smelled of stale beer and desperation. It was here, among the men who had lost the most to the drought and the failing economy, that a plan was born. The leader of this desperate congregation was a farmer named Jedediah Stone. He was a big man, with a face weathered by the sun and a spirit broken by 2 years of failed crops. He had lost his farm, the one his father had built, and he now worked as a hired hand, his pride a raw and festering wound. He saw the Radcliffes not just as a threat, but as an injustice. Their effortless success was a personal insult. He spoke to the other men in a low, rumbling voice, his words a potent cocktail of fear, resentment, and twisted scripture. He said that the town had tolerated the unnatural presence in their midst for too long. He said that neither the schoolteacher's books nor the doctor's medicine had been able to touch the evil that had taken root north of town. He declared that it was up to them, the common men of the soil, to cleanse their land. He spoke of fire. Fire was the great purifier. Fire was the one thing that could burn away a curse, sterilize the infected ground, and restore the natural order. His words found fertile ground in the hearts of the other men, men who felt powerless and forgotten, men who were desperate to strike back at the forces that had ruined their lives. On a moonless night in late October, a small group of them gathered at the edge of the Radcliffe property. There were 6 of them, led by Jedediah Stone. They carried lanterns and pitchforks, but their primary weapon was a collection of torches made from oil-soaked rags wrapped around thick branches. They moved through the darkness with a grim and nervous silence, the only sound the rustle of their boots in the dry grass and the frantic beating of their own hearts. They had decided to target the barn first. It was a large structure, filled with the impossible harvest of the Radcliffe wheat. To burn the barn was to burn the source of their unnatural prosperity. It was a symbolic act, a warning. As they crept closer, the unnerving silence of the Radcliffe farm settled over them like a shroud. The air grew cold. The familiar chirping of the crickets faded away. They could see the dark, angular shape of the farmhouse, its windows like vacant eyes watching them from the darkness. They reached the barn. The great wooden doors were closed but not locked. Jedediah Stone gave the signal. The men lit their torches, the sudden flare of light painting their grim faces in flickering shades of orange and red. They threw the torches onto the dry hay that was piled near the entrance and onto the roof of the structure itself. The fire caught quickly, with a hungry, crackling roar. Flames licked up the dry timber, climbing towards the night sky. For a moment, the men felt a surge of triumph. They had struck a blow against the darkness. They had taken action. They watched as the fire grew, a great raging pyre that lit up the entire farmstead. And then, the door to the Radcliffe house opened. The entire family emerged, one by one. Mr. Elias Radcliffe came first, followed by his wife and their 5 children. They walked out onto the porch and stood in a line, their faces illuminated by the inferno that was consuming their barn. They did not shout. They did not run for water. They simply stood and watched, their expressions as placid and unreadable as ever. Their stillness was the most terrifying thing the men had ever witnessed. The firelight danced in their pale, unblinking eyes. They were not afraid. As the roof of the barn began to collapse in a shower of sparks and embers, a strange thing happened. The wind, which had been still all night, suddenly picked up, but it did not blow in a single direction. It seemed to swirl around the farmhouse, creating a vortex that contained the fire. Embers that should have been carried on the wind, threatening the dry fields and the house itself, were instead lifted straight up into the sky, where they burned out and vanished. The fire was being contained by an invisible force. The men watched, their triumph turning to ice in their veins. They saw that the Radcliffe family was completely unharmed. Not a single spark, not a single piece of flying ash landed on them. Their dark clothing was untouched, their skin and hair free of any soot. They stood within the heart of a fiery storm, yet they remained as clean and serene as if they were watching a distant sunset. The sight broke the nerve of the vigilantes. This was not a power they could fight with fire and pitchforks. This was something ancient and untouchable. Jedediah Stone, his face pale with a terror that was far deeper than his anger had ever been, gave a choked cry and turned to run. The others followed, stumbling over each other in their haste to escape the impossible scene. They fled back into the darkness. The image of the silent, watching family burned into their minds. They did not stop running until they reached the relative safety of the town, their lungs burning, their minds reeling. They had tried to fight the curse, and in doing so, they had only proven its absolute power. The aftermath was not long in coming. The following morning, the wives of 3 of the men who had been part of the raiding party awoke to find their husbands dead in their beds. There was the wife of Jedediah Stone, the wife of a farmer named Marcus Thorne, and the wife of a young ranch hand named Peter Gable. The 3 men had died in their sleep, their faces peaceful, their bodies unmarked by any sign of violence or struggle. The town doctor, a nervous, elderly man named Dr. Hemlock, was summoned. He could find no cause of death. Their hearts had simply stopped. But it was when he performed a more thorough examination that he made the discovery that would plunge the entire town into a state of communal horror. When he opened the men's mouths, he found that their throats and lungs were filled with a fine, gray ash. It was the ash of burned hay and old timber. There had been no fire in their homes, no smoke. Their houses stood untouched, yet they had died of smoke inhalation. They had drowned in the ashes of the fire they themselves had set, a fire that had been miles away and had not touched a single hair on the heads of its intended victims. The news spread through Prairie Bend with the speed and finality of a death sentence. The curse was not passive, it was retaliatory. It was a sentient, wrathful force that could reach into the locked bedrooms of its enemies and fill their lungs with the ghost of a fire. The townspeople now understood. The Radcliffes were not merely vessels of the curse. They were inextricably bound to it. To attack them was to attack the curse itself, and the curse would respond with a silent, invisible, and utterly lethal force. The question was no longer whether the Radcliffes controlled the curse or were merely its vessel. The two were one and the same. They were a single entity. The town's fear, which had previously been a simmering, angry thing, now transformed into a state of profound and terrified submission. They understood that they were living next to a power that defied the laws of physics and could deliver death from a distance. The last vestiges of defiance were extinguished, replaced by a desperate, prayerful silence. The matter was now beyond the hands of farmers and vigilantes. It was a matter for God. The religious authorities, who had until now remained on the periphery, were forced to step in, declaring that the family's very existence was a heretical stain upon a God-fearing land. The deaths of the 3 men, their lungs mysteriously filled with ash, marked a turning point in the spiritual life of Prairie Bend. The event could not be explained away by science or reason. It was a clear and terrifying message, a piece of supernatural retribution that fell squarely within the domain of the church. The town's fear, once a secular and social anxiety, now became a matter of theology. The Radcliffe family was no longer seen as a social problem or a medical curiosity. They were seen as a spiritual contagion, a heretical presence that threatened the immortal souls of every person in the community. Pastor Miller, who had until this point acted with a cautious and measured concern, found himself swept up in the tide of his congregation's biblical dread. He was a good man, a man of sincere faith, but he was also a man of his time and place. He saw the hand of the devil in the impossible events that had unfolded. The unnatural prosperity, the duplicated children, the silencing of the doctor, and now, the ghostly, retributive deaths. It was a pattern of escalating evil that demanded a direct and forceful response from the agents of God on earth. He sent letters to the regional church authorities, his handwriting tight with a mixture of fear and righteous conviction. He described the situation in stark, apocalyptic terms. He spoke of a family that did not bleed or age in the manner of God's children, a family that commanded a power over the elements, a family that could kill from a distance with no weapon but a silent, vengeful will. He argued that this was not a matter for medicine or law, but for a rite of spiritual warfare. He was requesting permission and guidance to perform an exorcism. The response, when it came, was hesitant. The higher church authorities were men of a more modern and less superstitious bent. They were wary of condoning a ritual that was seen by many as a relic of a darker, more ignorant age. But Pastor Miller's desperate sincerity, combined with corroborating accounts from other members of the community, eventually swayed them. They granted him the authority to proceed, sending him a small leather-bound book containing the prescribed rites and prayers, along with a warning to act with the utmost caution and spiritual preparation. The exorcism was scheduled for a cold, windy night in early November. The town held its breath. The event was not to be a public spectacle. Pastor Miller had selected 2 witnesses to accompany him, 2 of the church's most devout and stoic elders, Mr. Henderson and Mr. Davies. They were solid, unflinching men who had faced down blizzards and droughts, and whose faith was as hard and unyielding as the frozen winter ground. The 3 men made their way to the Radcliffe farm as darkness fell, the wind whipping at their coats and carrying the scent of snow. They carried with them a single lantern, a Bible, a wooden cross, and a small vial of holy water. As they approached the property, the wind died down, and the same profound, unnatural silence that had greeted every other visitor descended upon them. The light from their lanterns seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive darkness, its beam barely penetrating a few feet ahead of them. They knocked on the door of the dark house. It was opened, as always, by Mr. Elias Radcliffe. His pale eyes showed no surprise, no fear, no emotion of any kind. Pastor Miller stated his purpose. He did not mince words. He said he had come in the name of God to cast out the unclean spirit that inhabited the house and the family. He said they were to submit to the rite for the salvation of their immortal souls. Mr. Radcliffe stared at him for a long moment, his gaze empty and ancient. Then, just as he had with the doctor, he stepped aside and allowed them to enter. The scene inside was identical to the one that had greeted Dr. Finch. The family was assembled in the main room, the children seated at the long table, their mother standing by the cold hearth. They were all dressed in their simple, dark clothing. They were all perfectly still. The air in the room was colder than the air outside, a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to leach the warmth from their very bones. The shadows in the corners of the room clung to the walls, dark and motionless. Pastor Miller was a man who had felt the presence of God in his life, a warm and comforting light. What he felt in this room was the opposite. It was a void, an absence of light and hope. It was a presence of immense and ancient emptiness. He steeled himself, his hand tightening on the wooden cross. He began the rite. He opened the book and began to read the prayers in a loud, clear voice, his words echoing in the dead silence of the room. He spoke of the power of Christ to command the demons, to break the bonds of sin, to cast the servants of darkness back into the pit from which they came. As he spoke, the Radcliffe family simply watched him. Their faces were blank, their bodies were motionless. They did not react. Mr. Henderson and Mr. Davies stood behind the pastor, their own hands clutching smaller crosses, their lips moving in silent prayer. They were the spiritual guards, their faith a supposed shield against the evil in the room. The pastor raised the vial of holy water. He walked towards the children and sprinkled the water on them, making the sign of the cross in the air. He said the words. He commanded the unclean spirit to leave them. The droplets of water landed on the children's foreheads, on their hands, on their dark clothing. The water did not sizzle. It did not burn them. It simply rested there, like beads of ordinary dew. The children did not flinch. They did not cry out. But then, something did happen. As the pastor completed the blessing, the 5 children, from the 13-year-old Thomas to the 7-year-old Samuel, all turned their heads in perfect unison. They looked not at the pastor, but at the large, shadowed crucifix that hung on the wall of their own home, a crucifix that Pastor Miller hadn't even noticed until that moment. A deep, resonant hum began to fill the room, a low-frequency vibration that the men felt in their teeth and in the hollows of their chests. The flame in their lantern flickered wildly, casting the room in a disorienting, strobing light. And then the children spoke. They spoke in a single, unified voice. It was not the voice of a child, nor of a man or a woman. It was a voice that was both young and old, a composite of all 5 of their voices blended into one, and yet it was something else entirely. It was a voice that was as cold and empty as a winter grave. And they were not screaming or cursing. They were reciting scripture. They began to speak passages from the Old Testament, verses that the pastor had not uttered, verses that he had not even read in years. They spoke of the desolation of Tyre, of the fall of Babylon, of the salt pillars of Sodom. Their unified voice was flat, emotionless, and perfectly clear. They recited the ancient words of ruin and divine abandonment, their pale eyes still fixed on the crucifix on the wall. The shadow cast by the crucifix, which should have been stationary in the flickering lamplight, began to bend. It contorted itself, twisting against the wall in a way that defied the laws of light and perspective. It seemed to writhe, as if it were a living thing in agony. Pastor Miller stumbled back, his own prayers dying in his throat. The words of the children were not a response to his exorcism. They were a counter-ritual. They were using the words of his own faith as a weapon against him. The humming grew louder, more intense. The cold in the room deepened. The pastor felt a sudden, sharp pain in his head, a pressure building behind his eyes as if his skull were about to crack. He dropped the Bible. He dropped the cross. He raised his hands to his temples, a strangled gasp escaping his lips. Mr. Henderson and Mr. Davies rushed to his side. They saw a thin trickle of dark blood seeping from the pastor's nose. Then another trickle from his ears. He collapsed to the floor, his body convulsing, his eyes rolled back in his head. The 2 elders, their faith shattered by the raw, undeniable power they had just witnessed, grabbed their fallen pastor and dragged him from the house. They fled into the night, leaving the Radcliffe family standing silent and victorious in their cold, dark home. Pastor Miller did not die, but the man who had entered the Radcliffe house was gone forever. He spent the next 3 days in a state of delirious fever, his body racked with tremors. When the fever finally broke, his mind was gone. He was left in a state of perpetual, babbling insanity. He could no longer form coherent sentences. He could only repeat a single word over and over again, a name that he would whisper to the empty walls of his room for the rest of his short life. Radcliffe. The failure of the exorcism was the final, devastating blow to the morale of Prairie Bend. The curse had resisted science. Now, it had resisted and broken the power of faith. It had consumed their doctor's reason and their pastor's sanity. It was a power that stood outside of and above the two pillars of their civilization. There was nothing left to do. There was no one left to turn to. The community was defeated, not by a physical force, but by a creeping, spiritual horror that they could neither fight nor comprehend. And then, as if their purpose in Prairie Bend had been fulfilled, the Radcliffes vanished. The family disappeared from their home without warning, without a trace, leaving everything behind and plunging the town into a new and even more profound state of mystery. The final chapter of the Radcliffe family's time in Kansas was not written in fire or in scripture, but in silence. A week after the failed exorcism had broken Pastor Miller, a new and different kind of stillness settled over the land north of town. The thin plume of smoke that had constantly risen from the Radcliffe chimney was gone. For 2 days, no one in the family was seen. No figures worked the fields. No small boy stood whispering to the shadows at dusk. The people of Prairie Bend, now operating from a place of deep, instinctual fear, noticed this absence. They spoke about it in hushed tones, not with relief, but with a new kind of anxiety. The devil you know is better than the devil you do not. The Radcliffe's presence had been a terrifying certainty. Their absence was a terrifying unknown. Finally, after a 3rd day of inactivity, the town sheriff, a reluctant man named Bartholomew Cole, was compelled to act. He was not a brave man, but he was a man who wore a badge, and the last tattered shreds of civic duty demanded he investigate. He gathered a small posse of 3 of the town's most stoic men, not for protection, for they all knew that no earthly weapon would be of any use, but simply for the comfort of shared witness. They rode out to the farm on a gray, overcast morning, the sky the color of old iron. As they approached the property, they did not feel the familiar, oppressive cold or the heavy silence. Instead, there was just an emptiness, a profound and hollow void where the malevolent presence had once been. The farm was not just quiet, it was inert. The front door of the house was ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. Sheriff Cole, his hand resting on the butt of a pistol he knew was useless, pushed it open and stepped inside. The other men followed, their boots echoing on the wooden floorboards. The house was empty, but it was not the emptiness of a family that had packed up and moved on. It was the emptiness of a people who had vanished mid-action. In the main room, the long wooden table was set for a meal that had never been finished. 5 plates were laid out, each with a portion of bread and dried meat. A pitcher of water sat in the center of the table, half full. It was as if the family had been called away from their supper by a silent, irresistible summons. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no indication of a hasty departure. Everything was in its place, clean, orderly, and stark. The family's few possessions were still there. Simple clothes were folded in the bedrooms. The strange, severe crucifix still hung on the wall, its shadow now behaving with perfect, geometric propriety. In one of the back rooms, a room that seemed to belong to the children, they found the only clue, if it could be called that. On the floor were several sheets of paper covered in drawings. They were not the drawings of children. They were not pictures of houses or animals or smiling suns. They were intricate, geometric symbols, drawn with the same impossible, identical precision as their handwriting. The symbols were complex. made of interlocking circles, sharp angles, and spiraling lines. They were vaguely reminiscent of the occult symbols the sheriff had seen in books, but these were different. They felt older, more alien. Tucked beneath the pile of drawings was a small, leather-bound journal. It was not a diary of daily events. Its pages were filled with the same strange symbols, drawn over and over again, an obsessive, repetitive catalog of an unknown language. In the margins, written in that same perfect mechanical script, were what appeared to be astronomical charts, maps of star constellations that the men did not recognize. And in the very back of the book, they found a single page with a genealogy, a family tree. It traced the Radcliffe name back not for generations but for centuries, through periods of history and parts of the world that made no sense. It was a document that seemed to describe a lineage far older and more widespread than a simple family of Kansas farmers. The posse left the house, their minds reeling with a new layer of unanswerable questions. They searched the property, the fields, the burnt-out shell of the barn. They found nothing. No tracks leading away from the farm. No sign of a wagon. The Radcliffe family had simply ceased to be there. They had evaporated from the face of the earth, leaving behind only a half-eaten meal and a book of impossible symbols. In the weeks and months that followed, the story of their disappearance became the final, haunting postscript to their legend. The town of Prairie Bend slowly began to recover, but it was a recovery that was built on a foundation of communal trauma. They tried to forget, to bury the memory of the silent family and the curse they had brought with them, but the land would not let them. The Radcliffe farm was declared abandoned and fell into the possession of the county. It was put up for auction, but no one would buy it. No one would even set foot on the property. The 500 acres that Elias Radcliffe had purchased with gold coin became a permanent dead zone, a patch of cursed earth that the community collectively shunned. A strange and enduring blight settled upon it. The fields where the unnatural wheat had grown twice now refused to grow anything at all. The soil, which should have been fertile, became barren and sterile. Weeds would not even take root there. Around its borders, the prairie grass grew tall and green, but inside the property line of the Radcliffe farm, there was only bare, cracked dirt. For decades, it remained that way, an unnaturally barren scar on the face of the Kansas landscape, a constant, physical reminder of the story that everyone was trying to forget. The farmhouse itself stood for many years, slowly decaying under the sun and the snow, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the fields that would not grow. Children would dare each other to run up and touch the rotting porch, but few ever did. It was a place of ghosts, a place where the rules of the world had been broken. In the 20th century, as the town of Prairie Bend grew and changed, the story of the Radcliffes began to fade from living memory into the realm of folklore. It became a ghost story told to frighten children, a local legend that lost its sharp edges of truth with each passing generation. Modern descendants of the original townsfolk, when asked about the story, would often deny it ever happened. They would say it was just a tall tale, a product of the superstitions of their uneducated ancestors. They would claim that official records showed no evidence of a family named Radcliffe ever owning that land, and in some ways, they were right. The original deed, the one signed by Elias Radcliffe and Mr. Abernathy, had mysteriously vanished from the county records office sometime in the early 1900s. The paper trail, like the family itself, had simply disappeared. But the story survived. It survived in the hushed conversations of the old, in the name of the barren patch of land that the locals still called the Radcliffe Place. It survived because the core questions it posed were never answered. Did the Radcliffes escape their curse, or did they simply move on to spread it elsewhere? Were they victims of a supernatural affliction, Or were they its willing agents? Were they even human at all? The narrative leaves the family unresolved, a piece of dark, American folklore that demands the listener fill the silence with their own fear. The scientific explanation failed. The religious intervention failed. All that remains is the unsettling tale of a prosperous family who carried with them a quiet, creeping dread, a family who shared a single pulse and a single soul, a family who proved that some curses, some sinister truths, cannot be explained by science or exorcised by faith. They can only be witnessed, and then, if one is lucky, forgotten. The final entry on the Radcliffe family has been written, yet its echoes may still reach you. If this is your first visit to our archives, subscribe to join us when the next truth emerges from the dust, and write in the comments what you felt as the story unfolded.